where we give
those other guys
the finger.
You're listening to Z-Talk Radio Network.
Welcome to the Mind's Eye Show. I'm your host, Brian Turnof, and you're listening to Z-Talk Radio. Our guest for this edition is author and sports writer Robert Weintraub. His previous books include The House That Ruth Built and Jewish Jocks, an Unorthodox Hall of Fame. In addition to writing, Robert Weintraub is a television producer with dozens of credits on outlets such as ESPN, Turner Sports, CNN, Discovery, ABC Sports, and many more. We'll discuss his latest book, The Victory Season, the End of World War II and the Birth of Baseball's Golden Age. In 1945, Major League Baseball had become a ghost of itself. Parks were half empty, mediocre replacements roamed the fields, as hundreds of players, including the game's biggest stars, were serving abroad in World War II. But by the spring of 1946, the country was ready to heal. The war was finally over, and as America's fathers and brothers were coming home, so too were the sports greats. The Victory Season brings to vivid life these years of baseball and war, including the little-known Overseas World Series that servicemen played in fall 1945. Robert Weintraub's extensive research and vibrant storytelling enliven the legendary season that embodies what we now think of as the game's golden era. Back in less than a minute with author Robert Weintraub on The Victory Season, the end of World War II, and the birth of baseball's golden age.
I am living on Channel Z.
You're listening to Z-Talk Radio Network.
I am living on Channel Z.
We're back with author and sports writer Robert Weintraub to discuss his latest, The Victory Season, the end of World War II and the birth of baseball's golden age. Thank you so much for joining the Mind's Eye Show today.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for having me.
Oh, my pleasure. So you're a New Yorker just like myself. Mets, Yankees, another team. Reveal your true colors here to the listeners. Who's your baseball team?
Well, listen, I grew up pretty close to the stadium. I'm a Yankee fan at heart. Always have been. I feel like I grew up at the house that Ruth built, and that was the name of my first book, The House that Ruth Built, that documented the building of Yankee Stadium way back in 1923 and the Yankees' first championship season that year. So I am pinstriped through and through, red and blue.
All right, good. We'll continue the conversation then, since I'm a Yankees fan as well. Unfortunately, probably half the listeners probably just dropped out because half of them probably hate them anyway. But they'll enjoy the interview today if they're a lover of the history of the game.
If they're not used to it by now, I don't know what to tell them. The Yankees run the stick.
Yeah, no doubt about that. But before we discuss the past and how it's affected games today, let's focus a little bit on the present season for the moment. Of course, we know there's still a lot left. It's a very long, unforgiving season. But let's have a little prediction time. What's the prediction for the Yankees?
For the Yankees?
Yeah, this season.
I think I really do think, provided that we don't see a rash of elbow and shoulder injuries to the pitchers, as has been what's been happening throughout the league, and obviously happened to Ivan Nova already. Provided they can keep the rest of the staff, basically healthy, not lose these guys for the season, especially Tanaka-san and Michael Pineda, get him back healthy. I think they'll be in it all year long. It doesn't appear to me like there's an AL East team that's capable of really distancing themselves from the pack. I've given them certainly a good crack to be in the hunt for the wild card right down to the end, if nothing else. And as good a chance as any to win the division. I don't see why not. They're not a 100-win team by any stretch, but I think this year 90 wins probably wins that division, and maybe 88 gets you into the playoffs even. So I certainly think the Yankees are capable of that. And as long as, the old guys stay upright.
Yeah, that's the big
one. Stays in the lineup, and Derek Jeter, manages to make it through his retirement tour and saves the rocking chairs for the end of the season. I think they have a more than decent chance of at least making the postseason. And then after that, obviously, it's all a crapshoot.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. So once we get to the playoffs, who do you think is coming out of the NL and AL? Just based on the trends that you're seeing now, it's a long season, but give me another prediction.
Yeah.
There. And who's going to win it all, of course?
Before the season, I picked the Dodgers and the Tigers. I don't really see any reason for the time being to change that. Obviously, if Clayton Kershaw goes down or Justin Verlander goes down, things definitely would have to be reassessed. But for the moment, I feel like those are the two strongest teams, most balanced teams. Obviously, the payrolls are quite high.
That doesn't hurt, of course.
That's something. But listen, no problem there. I'm a Yankee fan, so that's the.
We're not going to bitch about it, so to speak.
Yeah, and they have the power pitching, they have the power bats. I mean, at the end of the day, that's what wins. I feel like in the postseason, and they have the depth to make it through in good shape. I don't know that they'll be the number one seeds in their respective leagues in terms of the postseason, but I feel like those are the two strongest teams. And when it comes playoff time, they'll flex their muscles a little bit and meet up in it. What would be a really interesting World Series.
Yeah, that would be fascinating. Definitely entertaining, to say the least, and that's what fans want.
Yeah.
Before you talked about your earlier book, and I noticed that you like to talk about baseball's history, its earlier years, their players. And why focus on the early eras when, quite frankly, there's so much scandal right now within the last couple of decades that could just fill you up for the rest of your life, probably?
No doubt about that. It's a combination of factors. I feel like baseball in particular, the history of the game is so rich, so detailed, so interesting. But at the same time, if you don't return to it, it can be forgotten, and you hate to see that. There's so many great legends and so much interesting stuff, but that also resonates today. I mean, the career and life of Babe Ruth, scandals were aplenty in his life too. And as I always tell people who ask me, would Babe Ruth have used steroids? I always say, yeah, he would have been the first one coming out of the can with a needle sticking out of his butt. So there's no doubt about it. History of baseball is not only really fun to read about, it's really fun to write about and research, which is a real help when you're trying to write a 400-page book. It helps to have it be enjoyable. So that's part of the reason, and I've always been certainly very interested in it. I think the modern day, as you say, the last couple of decades are going to be very interesting to look back on from a historical perspective as well, but it sort of has to play itself out a little bit more. It's hard to take the sort of big picture view of it while you're still living it and while we're still in it. It feels like we're just kind of getting our arms around the whole steroid era, quote unquote, and what the sort of bounce back now we're feeling with this incredible dominance of pitching at the moment. And it still needs a little bit of time to play out and see exactly what the fallout will be. Will Barry Bonds and Mark McGwire and Roger Clemens make the Hall of Fame? Will there be an eventual sort of, that's the steroid era, the same way baseball was without African Americans and Latinos for so many years, and that inflated the numbers of the players who played before that. And we can go on, but that's a main part of the reason why I think I'm attracted to the further ago history of baseball at the moment, just because while writing about the current day is certainly fun and interesting, I like to take the bigger perspective, and I don't know if we can really do that just yet until more time passes.
Yeah, especially as the journalist of someone who's your quality in the research of quality, the quality of research that you do. And as a history guy, I really enjoy your writing because you make it such an enjoyable read. So let's get down to business and talk about your latest book, The Victory Season. Just give the basic premise of the book for the listeners.
Sure. Well, the Victory Season itself is the 1946 season, which obviously was the first season after World War II ended. And all the players who had gone off to war, whether to fight or to just be in uniform and PR purposes, everybody came back to the U.S. and played baseball again. And it really was a sea change, not only for baseball, a real, kind of bright, shining fork in the road, but it was for the country as well. Obviously, World War II changed quite a number of things throughout the world, and in baseball as well. And it's really just a kind of a two-pronged story. It tells what happened on the field, but it also goes back and tells the story of guys, who served during World War II. And as I said, there were a lot of fascinating and really unknown things that I managed to uncover in the research and write about, which I had no idea about, even as a lifelong baseball fan and a history fan, history buff, I guess. And, it tells the stories of the guys who went off to fight, for their country and then came back and rejoined baseball, which had kept going during the war with a very subpar product. And then, the fans who were still at home, the home front, once the war ended, were so enamored and so happy that baseball was back. Attendance records were set all across the country in both major and minor league ballparks. And there was a real hunger for the game. And that really kind of kicked off what we refer to as the golden era, the golden age of baseball, which was, sort of 1947 to 1957. It really began with that first season after the war when all the stars came back from Europe and the Pacific.
Yeah, and you really laid out throughout the whole book. I really enjoyed reading it, specifically as a history lover, a fan of baseball. It was an emotional roller coaster. I found myself laughing out loud, then cursing at the book, specifically as a Yankees fan, really.
Right.
Particularly impressive was the amount of research you went into, the pictures, the details, the stories, so many little tidbits. If you're a history lover, a fan of baseball, this is the book for you. So many little things, the birth of the Green Monster, just for a moment, Ty Cobb's infamous temper, the amount of research. How long did it take you to research the book? And it must have been a labor of love for you.
Yeah, it definitely was. I guess the whole project from start to finish basically took just under 2 years, basically, 22 months, something like that. And, you're really researching and writing kind of the whole time, but I devoted, I'd say, a solid, 9 months to a year that just doing research, putting it all together, trying to find the storyline that, took you all the way through the narrative thrust, and then all the the little juicy details and all the anecdotes like you referred to and all the stuff that makes it really fun, to read. Hopefully I appreciate your compliments about it. And all the, stuff that took place off the field as well, all the behind the scenes machinations that were going on that year. And there was a real power struggle going on, kind of in the front offices of the league. So it was a lot of research, a lot of work, and you're never really finished. They just kind of take it away from you at the deadline and say, okay, that's it, you're done. And I said, no, let me just change this one or two things. Yeah, you're done. Yeah, you could do it forever. So, finally I said, okay, that's enough. We got it. And, it's for the public now to decide.
Yeah, I recommend it highly. And 2 years for the research, the amount of research, that's really impressive. You get that done in that little of time, really. But
yeah, the Hall of Fame, the Baseball Hall of Fame up in Cooperstown, it was a real help, a real resource. I spent a few days up there in midwinter, which is an unusual time to be at the Baseball Hall of Fame, as you can imagine. You can park right in front of the place and just kind of walk in, and you look out the window and there's 6 feet of snow, but you're reading about the spring and summer game. It's pretty funny, but they were a great help. They have a huge library and an incredible, as you can imagine, vault full of research materials and clip files and everything. So that really assisted me. And then, the rest is, through the internet, I guess. I don't know how anybody wrote a history book before the internet came about. That
must have taken them at least 2 decades.
Yeah, I can't imagine having actually, every time I had a question, you can literally dig up the box score of any game played in 1946 or 1923 for my first book. It's pretty amazing to think that before, 15 years ago, writers were having to go to the library to check every little detail and pull up old, musty newspaper microfilm clippings of these box scores of games played 80 years ago. It's just, I don't know if I would have really even been able to write a book had I not had the internet. I don't know if I would have even gotten started. So there's a message for you kids out there. It's easier now. You got the internet. You're good to go. Let's get some good history books
appreciate it a little more, please, just after hearing that. Yeah. And you must have felt like a kid in the candy store at Cooperstown, I would imagine, with the vault.
Yeah. There's no doubt about that. Yeah, you're surrounded by the history. It's great.
So the book opens as World War II is winding down, the soldiers are returning, it's the 46th season, it's about to begin. A momentous but really a disruptive year in American history, in which throughout the whole book you show how baseball becomes really a microcosm of the hardships and the hard choices Americans were facing in the post-war life.
Yes, I think the popular conception, from the big pictures is true, but, most people think, World War II ended. and peace was declared across the world, and America ruled, Pax Americana, and it was a real time of prosperity across the country, and everything was great. And that's true, sort of in the big 20-year window, but immediately after the war ended, that definitely wasn't true. America really was as unprepared for sudden peace as it had been for sudden war after Pearl Harbor, and President Truman had wanted to leave millions of troops overseas, and bring them home piece by piece. But unfortunately, he was unable to do that. As you can imagine, all of America's, women wanted their sons and fathers and brothers and uncles back home immediately, right once peace was declared. So really, all the troops came back en masse, and that was a real hardship for the country. There were massive shortages. There was housing shortages, transportation shortages, any kind of goods. A huge black market opened up, which really made life difficult for the average American. There were strikes all across the country as the various unions who had kind of put aside their demands for the good of the war effort now, said, okay, war's over, time for us to get what we want. And pretty much everybody either knew somebody on strike or was on strike themselves or was affected by a strike at some point in 1946, and that includes baseball, obviously, as well. So it was really, the average American, right after the war ended, you would think they would be all celebratory, and to a degree that was true, but for the most part, 1946 itself was a kind of a difficult year, a day-to-day slog as America kind of readjusted to peacetime, and really the only thing that they could grasp onto that was consistent and good in their lives was baseball, thanks to all the stars coming back and having such a great season. And that was a big part of the reason that the interest and the attendance exploded so greatly that year, was in part because everyday life was, not that great for a lot of people, and it was, kind of a bummer otherwise. So at least they could, spend a couple hours with the baseball team and kind of dream about when real good times would be coming back, which they knew was just over the horizon, but it wasn't there yet.
Yeah, and it became baseball became a stress relief, a release valve, really.
Yeah.
Yeah. Opinions to enter World War II, it had a dividing effect throughout the whole country. It really was evident throughout the players' perspectives, their point of views. Some enlisted automatically, others it really took some pressure from the public and media to make them do so. And upon their return, the reflections of their experiences really revealed different perspectives. And that divide was highlighted, I think, and you go throughout the book between stars like DiMaggio and I believe it was Warren Spahn.
Yeah, as you say, there were definitely some differences in terms of, gung-ho-ness and patriotism. It's kind of unfair to slander the guys.
No, of course not.
Joe DiMaggio and Ted Williams, from their perspective, they obviously were superstars. They just, in 1941, both of them had two of the greatest seasons of all time. They were making a heck of a lot of money, more than just about everybody else in the game. And they knew that they were not likely to be called upon to actually pick up a rifle and fight. So, the fact that they took a good amount of time to, kind of be prodded into joining the service, you have to take it with a little bit of context there. But it's definitely true that they had suffered a PR nightmare after players like Bob Feller and Hank Greenberg, who were also superstars, signed up immediately after Pearl Harbor and said, baseball is not important anymore. We're at war. Bob Feller himself said, we're at war and we're losing. I need to go fight. This is, much bigger than some silly game. So there was definitely a dichotomy in that sense. And then you had a lot of guys like Joe DiMaggio, as we mentioned, and various other stars who, kind of, not only did they not see action in terms of combat, but mostly viewed the war as an inconvenience. Joe in particular basically spent the whole time thinking about how much money he was losing by, being in the service and not being at Yankee Stadium. But then you had other guys, who actually fought and saw combat and were, really affected by that. Bob Feller and Warren Spahn, as you mentioned, two of the ones who leaped in mind the most. Bob Feller was in the Navy, and he served on a battleship, the USS Alabama, and saw combat virtually every, major engagement in the Pacific War. And, his job was to call in or guide the gunnery crews at approaching Japanese aircraft and make sure they didn't bomb his ship, to the bottom of the sea. So that was, kind of a high-stress, difficult job, and, he was very proud of the fact that no one on the Alabama was ever killed during the war because of enemy aircraft. That speaks to his resolve and his skill at that particular job. And Warren Spahn was an engineer who was almost killed while building a bridge across the Remagen during, kind of a well-known advance. The famous bridge at Remagen, who fans out there might have heard of that, when the U.S., the Allies forces tried to build a bridgehead, into Germany. And the bridge he was standing on, 2 seconds after he walked off it, collapsed, killing, scores of engineers. And he was very, very lucky not to have been killed himself. And both men, when, they kind of returned to the States and got back to peacetime and baseball, and it seemed like it was so normal, and it was kind of a strange thing for them, having so recently been at war. And both of them were, in agreement. After you've seen war and after you've been through what they had been through, Bob Feller said it directly, pitching at Yankee Stadium doesn't carry the same amount of nervous energy that it used to. I'm not scared of doing these things. And Feller in particular proved that by throwing a no-hitter at Yankee Stadium on April 30, 1946, to kind of get the season going. And Warren Spahn, before the war, hadn't really started his major league career yet. He had been kind of wild, kind of overeager, kind of, just not in the right mindset for approaching the game. And, he was very vocal after the war, saying, now it's much easier for me to relax and just concentrate on what I have to do, because I don't feel the pressure I used to. Once you've gone to sleep, at night in the tracks left by a tank, or, stayed up and fighting all night long, or, seen the things that I've seen, there's just no comparison to a game of baseball. So he relaxed and became the all-time winningest pitcher, left-handed pitcher in baseball history. So obviously he knew what he was talking about. So, it really, obviously every player was different, but, there was no one who was completely unaffected by their experiences, whether or not they saw combat or not. And, like I said, that was really one of the main reasons I wanted to write the book, was just to explore these guys' different reactions to war and how it affected them and how it affected their baseball when they came back home.
Yeah, and you really get into their shoes and their perspective. I really enjoyed some of the hidden history, and this is something I didn't even know before reading your book about the World Series that was held on foreign soil. If you can talk just a little bit about that and the genesis of the foreign World Series.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it's called the European Theater of Operations World Series. It took place in September of 1945, right after the war ended. Basically, you had all these troops hanging around once peace was declared in Europe, and they had a lot of weapons. They had just seized all the German breweries, and they didn't have anything to do, so there was a lot of trouble brewing. So somebody around there said, let's get a baseball intramural league going, and the incredibly ironic and interesting thing about it is where they played. It was in Nuremberg, of course, the spiritual home of the Nazi Party and of Hitler and Goebbels and all the guys, where they had those giant parades and espoused their hatred and, the Third Reich will live forever, et cetera. And they actually, that stadium, the Hitler Youth Stadium in Nuremberg, was conquered and then repurposed as an athletic facility, mainly for baseball. And you had American soldiers playing baseball right there where Hitler had given all these speeches that, are well known in the films of Leni Riefenstahl and, the pictures that we've all seen in the images from those. So it was really kind of an astounding turn of events. Here you have, just a few years later, you have baseball players on this holy part of the Nazi Party. And they played an all-Germany tournament. All the best soldiers were kind of all the soldiers who had baseball experience were kind of put on one team, the 71st Division Red Circlers, they were called, led by Harry Walker, a St. Louis Cardinals outfielder. And they easily won the tournament for all Germany. Then they decided to import the best team from France and kind of have a true European Theater of Operations World Series, the best in Germany versus the best in France. And the team that was representing France was, much more of a ragtag assemblage, but they had a secret weapon, which was two Negro League Hall of Famers, Leon Day and Willard Home Run Brown. So you had really an out-of-town preview of what was coming as soon as the war was over and, peace was declared and everybody went back to the States. You had an African-American playing integrated baseball with whites in this tournament right there. Black players playing where the Nazis were saying, we are the Übermensch, Aryans rule, and blacks are, a lesser species. There's you can imagine what Hitler and Goebbels would have thought had they been able to watch those games being played.
Yeah, amazing juxtaposition.
Yeah, exactly. And the Negro Leaguers actually led the big upset, and the French-based team won in 5 games thanks to those two players. Leon Day scored the tying run, and Willard Brown knocked in the winning run in the deciding fifth game. They all went back to France, and they had a big festival, a big buffet and a party to celebrate their victory. And the two African-American players chowed down right alongside their white teammates, which, of course, back in America, that's something they would not have been able to be a right they would not have been granted. So it was really an astounding little piece of history and really an out-of-town preview of what was about to happen, and just sort of an amazing vision of all these soldiers not only playing baseball, but the stands were filled with 50,000 screaming, drinking, betting fans. All of them were soldiers, and all of them were giving a little taste of what they were about to have when they went back home and got to experience a world without war.
How large of an effect do you think the mixed race game at the Foreign World Series had on breaking down the color barrier the following year, if any at all?
Well, I don't know that game specifically, those games specifically did, but I think the experience, it wasn't unusual for obviously when when soldiers and servicemen at their various bases had downtime, which obviously was frequently, they played baseball as a sort of way to blow off steam, and oftentimes you had black players playing alongside the whites. It's just sort of a pickup game. It's not even anything, as formal as that European Theater of Operations World Series. And I think it, that along with the war in general and the experience of a lot of whites, just serving alongside African Americans, maybe not directly in the same unit, but, they were definitely in the same theater of operations, definitely on Normandy Beach together, definitely on the various coral reefs of the Pacific together. And I think it had the effect of basically a lot of whites for the first time really got to talk to and just know and even see African American people and to see them as something other than a boogeyman. And that sort of has the usual effect of, getting past what you don't know. Everyone's so afraid of what they don't know. That's where racism is really kind of at its root in a lot of cases. And then here you had an opportunity for whites and blacks to mend and bond, to mesh rather, and bond over baseball. And that was only heightened by the games at the Nuremberg, the Hitler Youth Stadium. But, I think it was happening on kind of nameless, little spits of land all over the Pacific and at bases around the United States even, where a lot of these guys were playing, with black for the first time. And a lot of places that was not allowed. And here they were able to do it on, various military bases. And, that really broke down a lot of barriers. So by the time Jackie Robinson came on the next year in 1946, I won't say that it was, hunky-dory by any stretch, but at least there was a foundation, a precedent, and an ability for him to come in and in a context of baseball, which, had been built other than, it's not like he was running for president or, kind of taking over a corporation or anything like that. In strictly baseball terms, there was an understanding that, yes, blacks could definitely play, and they could play with whites, and the civilization wouldn't end if such a thing happened. So I definitely think it was important. The war definitely changed a lot in that respect.
And so in the 1946 season, it's about to start. It really was the birth of baseball's golden age. But with birth, there's a lot of growing pains, and to break down the color barrier, like you just said, to loosen the grip of the owner's economic stranglehold on the players. It really could have turned out very differently in so many situations. The owners weren't really just going to give away their power. It kind of almost had to be taken away from them, specifically with breaking down the color barrier. Do you think that it was more outright racism or fear of maybe economic losses for the owners' reasoning for not breaking the color barrier sooner?
Yeah, I mean, there was certainly an element of prejudice involved, but as with most things in life, I think money was the main factor, and really operated. It kind of controlled their operations and the way they saw the world. I mean, before Jackie Robinson, finally broke the barrier, the Negro Leagues kind of were a moneymaker for the owners, the Major League Baseball owners, in that they rented out their stadiums for the Negro Leagues to play. They were able to do cross promotions with them. They were able to kind of, use them and make money off them while not actually playing with them. It was sort of a plantation style experience right there in plain sight, which obviously was not good. And it really took Branch Rickey who is the Brooklyn Dodgers president, the man who decided at long last to bring an African American player into the major leagues. He's been sort of beatified over the years, sanctified for doing this, and there was an element of his judgment that said this is wrong, that these great players have not been allowed to play with whites, and it's not the right thing to do. There was a moral aspect to it, but I think you could definitely state that was in the minority in terms of his decision making. That was a lower percentage compared to the money that he thought could be made by making the team much better. Obviously, there was a glaring market inefficiency, if you will, that there were all these Negro League superstars out there, and if they could come onto one team, that team would obviously be made much better and make a lot more money from fans coming to watch them play, and by winning in the postseason and getting that all-important World Series check. So there was a lot more money there involved. And there was also going to be, as he saw it, Branch Rickey was obviously one of the main brains behind the minor league feeder system and tying, fresh young prospects to his team. And he saw, here was another wave of players that he could basically, kind of dominate and have the pick of the litter. So, there was definitely more than just simply the time had come for a black player, which it had, but obviously money was at the root of it, and that was also at the root of the resistance to him quite a bit. The other owners, especially the Yankees owner Larry McPhail, who had really spent the off season building up a sort of corporate, bubble over Yankee Stadium, and really, for the first time, surprisingly enough, kind of marketing the team and packaging the team toward the high-dollar New York business corporate fan rather than just the average Joe. And it was his thinking that particular fan who he was wooing to the ballpark was not going to be thrilled by the idea of black players mixing with the whites. He might have been wrong about that, but that was his feeling. So to him, he fought against the breaking down the color barrier, and it wasn't because he was a racist per se. It was because he saw it as something that would affect his bottom line, whereas Branch Rickey saw it as something that would positively affect his bottom line. So that's basically what it boiled down to. It was a money game, and I think we've seen that borne out throughout the history of baseball and life. That's pretty much the driving engine behind just about every decision. It worked out pretty well, though.
Yeah, 99% of, I guess, all answers to the questions, it's going to be green, it's going to be money. That's normally what the answer is going to be, no doubt about that.
Pretty much. It's all about the green.
Yeah. Jackie's minor league debut, which you just discussed in the book, I think it might have been maybe even more important than his major league debut for him personally to learn the lessons to deal with overt racism.
Yeah, I don't think there's any doubt about that. You have to understand Jackie's context and his background. He had played, obviously, with white players before at UCLA. He was a multi-sport athlete there, and he had played in front of white crowds and with white teammates. So in that aspect, he was sort of used to it. But, playing baseball and being the pioneer to, break this long-held color barrier was a whole different animal. Ironically enough, it was because of World War II that he was even, kind of the first African-American player. He really wasn't the best player available, but he was the only one that was sort of around in 1945. So many others were at war, and because Jackie had been court-martialed during the war over a racial incident, which he was exonerated for, but, it left a bitter taste in his mouth, so he decided to leave the Army, which the Army let him do. So he was playing Negro League baseball in 1945, as opposed to being in Europe fighting the Germans, and thus was able to be seen by Brooklyn scouts, Clyde Sukeforth, namely, who saw him play and liked his maturity level and liked the fact that, he was there and could display his wares other than, sort of taking a flyer on guys who had more talent maybe but weren't around to play. So he then was signed by the Dodgers, obviously, and he was assigned to the Montreal Royals, the AAA team for Brooklyn. And that was his debut, April 18th, 1946, in Jersey City against the Jersey City Giants. And he was, a real wreck before that happened. He had gone through a really trying spring training experience down in Florida, which was, of course, in the grip of Jim Crow. And, he was not allowed to play with his teammates in several minor league parks across Florida. And it had really been a tough experience for him. And, there was sort of a real open question for that first game, not only what would happen in the crowd and what would happen with the opposing team, but even what would happen with his teammates. Like, how would he be received? What would happen? the first time he did something good or bad. And Jackie was certainly worried about it too, and he described going out there for his first national anthem, and his heart was beating so loud it was drowning out the national anthem. And then, of course, being Jackie, he hit a home run in his debut and had a great game. And when he crossed home plate, his white teammate, the next man up, his name was George Shuba. George Shotgun Shuba was his nickname. And he just reached out and shook Jackie's hand and said, "Nice job." And in that moment, it was just sort of, the entire question mark about what would his teammates do, how would they treat a black man on their team, how would they react when, they were forced to congratulate an African American. It all just fell away by a matter-of-fact handshake from George Shuba. It was really an important moment and really kind of a glossed-over moment in American history. Obviously, the Jackie story has, been well-known and well-documented throughout. We just had a movie about his life in about the 1947 season, last year, I guess it was. But, where Pee Wee Reese's, kind of arm around the shoulder and, you'll be okay, Rook, don't worry about it, that has been celebrated and, there's even a statue of it in front of Citi Field in New York. The George Shuba handshake has been mostly forgotten. And really, it was as important, if not more so, for when it happened and what it meant. And it just allowed Jackie to relax and join the team and not have to, sort of watch his back, if you will. He still suffered a lot of racism that first year. The teams were all over him. In certain cities, especially ones that were more southern, as you might expect. One team threatened to come out in blackface before they were talked out of it. And Jackie actually had a nervous breakdown in mid-season and was, told to take a month off. And, of course, he only took one day off and then came right back to play, and he won the batting title. And Montreal won the World Series for AAA teams that year, and he went off the field a hero. And, that really set up his approach in 1947. He already knew he could play. He knew he could, compete at that level, and he knew he could play with white teammates and white fans who would accept him if he performed. That's basically what it boiled down to. So he took that approach, and obviously it worked out pretty well.
Yeah, listening to you right now talk about it, it just gives me goosebumps, and you can really tell it reverberates throughout history when you feel it on your skin. And everything could have turned out differently, but they really chose the right person for this. And for those just joining us on The Mind's Eye, we're talking with sports writer and author Robert Weintraub about his latest The Victory Season. And players from the pre-union era, they must have quite the conflicted feeling. Happy to see how much power the current MLB players' union wields. Maybe the strongest in North American sports, arguably in the world, but they must be a bit angry at themselves for letting their chance maybe to unionize slip through their hands. How do you think Ty Cobb and Ted Williams would view today's players, their contracts, and the power in the union's hand?
Yeah, with great jealousy, like you say. And, they would have looked at their bank accounts and said, wait a minute, it's not like Ty or Ted, were starving throughout their lives. So I guess in that sense, they probably would be okay with it. But the idea that, the average utility infielder would be making a king's ransom, in this day and age, it's just utterly foreign to them. The baseball was under the sway of what's called the reserve clause, which, basically tied player to team in perpetuity until the team decided, to trade or sell or cut that player, and the player had no recourse. Obviously, there was no free agency, and as you said, there was no union. And 1946 was really the first time that began to change, at least a little bit. I tell the story in the book. The man behind it was a man named Robert Murphy, who was a Boston labor lawyer. And he looked around at all the strikes that were going on in 1946. Everybody was trying to get theirs and improve their lot in life. And he looked at the baseball situation and said, this is ridiculous. Why aren't you guys going on strike? So he, talked to a lot of players, and he formed what was called the American Baseball Guild. It wasn't quite a union officially, but it was for all intents and purposes the same thing. And, he tried to get them to, if not actually abolish the reserve clause and get free agency, that might have been a bridge too far at that point, but definitely to get, more systems, more control, better pay, pensions, healthcare, that kind of thing. And while he was unsuccessful in calling for a strike, which he did in June of 1946 in Pittsburgh, obviously Pittsburgh was a strong union town. He got the Pirates to kind of get in the clubhouse before the game and vote on whether or not to walk off before their demands were met. And the team voted not to strike, to play, and that kind of killed the entire effort right there in its crib. But, that the entire effort that Murphy made and the willingness of the players to listen, and there were a few other elements to it that really scared the owners for the first time. They realized, these guys have all been to war. They just fought for freedom and liberation, essentially, and now they came home and they don't have any. And they knew that the status quo as it wasn't going to last. I mean, the first time it was challenged in court, it would have collapsed. So they fought a real rearguard action, again led by Larry McPhail, the Yankees owner, who kind of cannily decided to give the players a little bit, but not enough to really change things. And so they gave them, spring training per diems and a pension system and, a few more rights in terms of negotiating contracts. But the real lever of power, which was the reserve clause and the absence of free agency and the way that, the players held the owners held the players down for decades, that stayed because, the players were still mostly of a Depression era mindset. They were lucky to have a job, much less a job playing baseball, and they, weren't really ready to just completely disregard and completely demolish the entire structure and order of baseball, which of course then later happened 2 decades later. So for another generation or so, because of the efforts of the owners, especially Larry McPhail in 1946, baseball got this reprieve, and in a lot of ways that set up the golden era of baseball, because so much of what we romanticize about that era and what is beloved about the great players from that era is the fact that they all played for the same team pretty much their entire careers. And, Mickey Mantle and Duke Snider and those guys, Willie Mays, they didn't swap teams every 4 years and go around and, chase the highest, contract they could, at least, not so vividly and not in the public eye. So, there were good things and bad things about it, but obviously from the players' perspective, they missed an opportunity, and they just weren't really ready to embrace what was coming and what we now see today, which is obviously full-on mercantilism and full-on free agency. But, Ty Cobb would probably be rolling over in his grave right now if he saw what the players were making, that's for sure.
I'm rolling over in mine, and I'm still alive, so.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I felt like they really had this amazing chance to really unionize or get some rights there. The public was really eating out of their hands. I felt like the owners would have almost had to bow down to at least most of the players' demands. At least from my perspective, it seemed like they really let something slip through their hands.
I think you're right about that, and it was a big part of it was the owner's ability, and Larry McPhail especially, who was a real PR genius and a real, in a lot of ways, a real progressive, a real liberal in terms of what he wanted for baseball. He invented, for all intents and purposes, night baseball and baseball on the radio, and he wanted to put microphones on umpires and use yellow baseballs at night so they could be seen easier, and he put his team on airplanes for the first time for road trips. I mean, it's not like he was some stodgy conservative who just, was hidebound and unable to change. But, the bottom line was the most important thing, and he saw what others couldn't, which was that they, as you say, were in real trouble if the players really decided to get together and strongly challenge the foundational levers of power that they had their hands on and did not want to give up. They were going to have to do something. They could not leave things the way it was. But if they followed McPhail's advice and put on a PR offensive and seemed to be giving in to the players' demands, which of course they really weren't, but they did in sort of a public way at a smaller level, but not the big level, they could at least, fend off this opportunity, as you mentioned, that the players had to really change things. And the owners were successful. So, it was a great job, and Larry McPhail was considered a genius almost within owner circles for doing that. Of course, he was also a drunk and was forced to give up his ownership stake the very next year after a World Series party, which he attacked his fellow co-owners and got into a fight, and he was made to, sell the team after that. So he had his problems as devils, as demons as well. But in terms of the greater economic picture of baseball, he was he was a real important person in the history of the game.
Yeah, and he really was this larger-than-life character, especially throughout all the stories that you retold throughout the book. A really complex man, and you just said a little bit some of his influence on today's games. Night baseball, I think air travel. He was almost a precursor to Steinbrenner in a sense of his antics. I really had a love-hate relationship without him throughout the book. I love the stories, but he had an amazing... a profound effect on the game of baseball, and in many good ways, but really in also bad ways, particularly you alluded to before, where he pioneered creating class lines between baseball fans within the stadium.
Yeah. I think the Steinbrenner comparison is an apt one. I think there was a definite kind of combination of, real forward-thinking, real positives that he brought to the game, as you mentioned, just beyond the stuff that we thought about, and a real colorful character. This is a guy who, when he was fighting in World War I, had it in his head that he was going to try and kidnap Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany and he almost did. I mean, he actually got into his office. He got that close and stole his ashtray, but he couldn't actually pull off the coup, or maybe the arrestable offense of kidnapping the man. But that was the way his brain worked. Big, bold, history-making moves. He was not afraid. He basically bought the Yankees, on nothing but credit. I mean, you can imagine. And in a lot of ways, that was similar to Steinbrenner. He saw the opportunity when the value of this team was lower and depressed, in his case because of the war, and he swooped in and immediately turned around and made it into this incredible cash cow, in large part, as we've been talking about, by really playing up the idea of the corporate connection with baseball, and which had been sort of ignored or glossed over in most places before that. And it made him and his partners and the shareholders, everybody else who was involved with the team and Major League Baseball, very, very rich. And if it wasn't for his personal demons and for the things that he did, much like Steinbrenner behind the scenes, to really, he had a volcanic Irish temper, and he was always with a bottle in his hand, and was not very good and nice to the underlings around him. And he made a lot of enemies and a lot of waves. As you say, an incredibly complex and fascinating character who I kind of think has been mostly forgotten about and lost in baseball. Branch Rickey is still talked about and still, played by Harrison Ford in movies, and still really well known even to baseball fans today who don't necessarily know that much about history of baseball. But Larry McPhail was every bit his equal, and he was actually his he mentored under Branch, so they had a personal connection, and then wound up hating each other and fought over many of the foundations.
As you put it, I believe, in the book.
Exactly. Well, they fought over many of the foundational issues we've been talking about, tooth and nail. And they were very, very different people. But at the end of the day, they were both, titanic figures in the history of the game. And it would be nice if McPhail was, sort of, given more of a thought these days, put back into his proper historical place, because he certainly deserves it.
Yeah, definitely. And you just talked about Branch Rickey a little bit. Well, we've been talking about him throughout the whole time, and he also helped usher in many aspects of today's game.
Sure.
He was... do you think he was maybe a precursor to Billy Beane?
There's elements of that. There's no question about it. I mean, the direct thing is Branch Rickey actually hired a statistician to use to help gain an edge, and this is way back in the 1950s. That's the direct Moneyball line.
Right, yeah, exactly.
Even if you read the book,
6 years ahead of time.
Right, and he was forever conscious of that, what we said before, the market inefficiency, the way to help your team get better and win without spending as much money. I mean, Yankees didn't mind throwing the cash around. That's always been the case. They had it, and they threw it around and didn't mind spending vast amounts to win. It was sort of, it's not a sin in New York to spend lavishly as long as you're successful, right? Exactly. That's sort of the history of New York. Branch Rickey took a different approach. He came from St. Louis, and he was raised much more parsimoniously, I guess, and he wanted to make it a winner, but at the same time, the only pockets that would be lined would be his own and his partners, not, kind of this grand elemental, we're spending a lot and we're making a lot, and, we'll figure out the profits in the end. That's why the whole minor league system that he developed, and, before he came along, minor league teams were all independent, and he had the idea to tie them to his team specifically, so there would always be this fresh wave of young talent coming through. And if any of the players on his current team decided they wanted more money or held out in contract negotiations, they could be very easily replaced by the next guy coming up from the minors and sold off at a profit. That was the way the operation worked. That was his business model, and it was very successful. And of course, the use of Negro leaguers was basically along the same lines. He wanted to find a way to get an advantage and get players who were cheaper and replace ones who wanted more money. And he did a lot of little things that were, the kind of inventing of strike zones for practice and slotting pits and things like that were, way ahead of their time and very important. But in the big picture, what he did was, as you say, sort of played a Moneyball game and tried to get every advantage he could to the bottom line. That was the most important thing. That was the most important thing in his approach to baseball, and it worked out pretty well for him too.
Yeah, and it worked out well for us too, because he really helped usher in the modern age. And let's no doubt. And we've talked a lot about the social, the economic, the political issues of the 1946, but I'm sure a lot of listeners really want to hear about the baseball in itself. Talk about some of the reasons why it was so great to be a fan following that epic season. So many different things were happening.
Yeah, well, obviously the first and foremost, you had all the great players back. You had Ted Williams and Stan Musial and Joe DiMaggio and sort of, the next tier of stars, Country Slaughter, who was a great player for St. Louis, a real country hardball kind of guy, fast runner, and, wild man on the base path.
Another larger-than-life character in the book.
Yes, no doubt. And another one is Pete Reiser of the Brooklyn Dodgers, who was sort of, one of the greatest naturally talented players ever to come along, but was so reckless in terms of running into walls trying to catch fly balls that he wound up hurting himself so often, and he didn't really ever achieve what he thought he might because he was always hurt. And you obviously had to get Bob Teller breaking the strikeout record that season, 363 strikeouts in 1 year. Threw his arm off to do it, but he managed to break the record on the last day of the season. And so many, other players, great and small. It's still the nickname era when, players were granted colorful nicknames and they rode the trains and, hung out in the hotel lobbies. And, you asked me right at the outset about why I write about the history of the game and what's different and what's interesting about it. And the large part, the players then were just a part of society far more than they are today. The average player today, even the, kind of most average player, the replacement level player, is still so rich that he's in a tax bracket all his own and is cut off from society practically. They lived in gated communities. And back then it was not the case. They had jobs in the off season and they mingled with the fans in bars and in restaurants and in hotels and on the railroads. And it just made for a kind of more common man's game, a more colorful game, a more interesting game, and it was covered that way too. And there wasn't, huge layers of public relations flax between the players and the reporters. They could really get to know the guys, and you had a lot of interesting and a lot of reporters, a lot more reporters. There was always a different take on the games, and because they were only on the radio for the most part, they could really describe them in a far more interesting manner, and they were the only ones who had seen it, so they were, responsible for kind of setting the stage of how these players were perceived. So you had not only did you have great players, but just a great time for baseball, and it was much more interesting, in my opinion, than, even in the 60s or 70s. Not that it wasn't good then, but it was really a golden age, called that for a reason. I think that's a large reason why.
And do you think it was one of the best ever World Series matchups? The lineups in for those teams were a murderer's row. They were unbelievable.
Yeah, it was definitely a classic. Obviously, you had the Red Sox with Ted Williams, and also Johnny Pesky and Bobby Doerr and Dom DiMaggio, Joe DiMaggio's little brother, and Rudy York, and just, as you say, a real potent lineup. They ran away with the American League that season. And then the Cardinals, of course, Stan Musial and Harry Walker, as mentioned, and Country Slaughter, and so many great players of their own, Marty Marion. And incredibly, a team as good as the Cardinals, who had won 2 of the 3 World War II era series, was considered heavy underdogs to Boston. That's how good the Sox were. But, of course, history favors the underdogs, and it didn't favor Boston, that's for sure. That was really both of the curse of the Red Sox, quote unquote, in that series. And the Cardinals won in 7 games in one of the most famous plays and most dramatic plays in baseball history, really. The Country Slaughter Mad Dash, which he went from first to home on a single in the bottom of the 8th inning in a tie game in Game 7, when Johnny Pesky famously double-clutched the relay throw and didn't get him at the plate. Now, Johnny's been unfairly ruined by history because of that. I think he didn't really ever have a chance to throw out Slaughter at the plate, but still, in that moment where he held the ball, the curse of the Red Sox was really born, and they never, of course, won another title for many, many years until, sadly, he said as a Yankees fan, they finally did win in 2004. So Johnny was finally off the hook. But up until that point, that moment in 1946 really was a moment where a lot of psychic angst was created in the greater New England area.
And at the end of the book, I I really felt like I actually was there at the time of the season and witnessed all the intricacies and the in and outs of what makes a season great, particularly that epic season. And after reading the book, I couldn't help but think that some things never stay the same and some things never really change, in particular the redemptive nature of sports. As a descendant of World War II vet who loved baseball, I can't help feel a little bit of that connection more now after how he felt to return to the game to watch it. Now I know a little bit after watching a little bit after 9/11. I kind of understand the redemptive power of sports now a little more, and it made me think about that. That's really something that I took away from this book.
Well, thanks. Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's any doubt about it that sports has the power to unite all of us, and in something common that it's right there for the eye to see. It's a cliche, but it's true. The agony of defeat and the thrill of victory. It's there's no nuance when it comes to who won and who lost, and rallying around a team that represents your community and being able to ride the emotional highs and lows with that team. It might sound silly when you kind of write it down, let's talk it out in such black and white terms like that, but as we all know, it's incredibly emotional and incredibly dramatic, especially after national trauma like 9/11 or World War II, when for the right reasons sports take a back seat. But at the end of the day, the emotions and the things that make up sports, the character on display, are every bit as important as the things that happen in everyday life, and that gets revealed in the aftermath of these national traumas. And I think that's a real important part of why we're so quick to respond to sports in the wake of these things that happen, like after 9/11, especially for the modern listener. And I think it's very important, and it's great that we have sports, and it's great that we have something that we can all rally around as a nation, as a community, as a country to do. And that was definitely the case in 1946 as well, as I set out to prove.
And you definitely did. And the end of the show is quickly creeping up on us, but we only have a few minutes left. Any ideas for the next book yet? You maybe have a couple rattling in your head.
You know what? I have signed to do a third book, so I can reveal that to the audience.
All right, excellent.
It's not about sports though, so I am branching out, but it is about World War II. So at the fork in the road, when I mixed World War II and baseball for the last book, now instead of following the baseball path, I am following the World War II path, at least for this next book. And it's about a prisoner of war that was held by the Japanese, a very special prisoner of war who was actually a dog who was held for 3.5 years in a Japanese prison camp, survived 2 different sinkings of the ship that she was a mascot on. Her name was Judy. Survived long treks through the jungle, and of course the incredibly dramatic and privations of what was going on in these prison camps, and made a lasting friend in the camp. The two were separated when their ship was sunk, and then reunited in a different prison camp, and then never let each other out of their sight, and managed to have this incredible bond that saw them through the 3.5 years of being held by the Japanese, and for all that entailed, you can imagine. So it's really an amazing story, and I'm really looking forward to getting that one out there, and maybe coming back on the show and talking about that.
Yeah, you always have an open forum here. That sounds like an unbelievable story. We definitely would love to hear more about that and delve into it. And I know you have a bunch of events coming up where people can meet you. Share some of the details where fans can meet you and get some more information before we let you go.
Yeah, of course, I have a website, www.robwein, ROBWEIN.com. You can always get the books there, or send me, an email or whatever. I'm on Twitter @RobWein for that, people like that. Facebook page, both for the books and for myself. And you can always reach me through Little Brown, which is the publishing company, littlebrown.com. And, send me a note. Send me your recollections of 1946 if you're still alive, or talk about modern-day baseball. It's all good for me.
I deeply appreciate giving the Mind's Eye Show a piece of your time to talk about your latest, the victory season, the end of World War II, and the birth of baseball's golden age.
Anytime. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
For more information on Robert's book, upcoming guests, cherry-picked news articles, and much more, check out the Mind's Eye Show's website, themindseyemedia.com. Once more, themindseyemedia.com. Join me next week as we continue our back-to-back baseball special and go back even further into the sport's history. We'll welcome guest Brian Chip Martin to discuss his latest work, Baseball's Creation Myth, Adam Ford, Abner Graves, and their Cooperstown story. While the actual origins of the game of baseball remain subject to debate and study, new light is shed on the source of baseball's durable creation myth. Stay tuned for Haunted Harvest Moon with Vonda in the next hour. I'm your host, Brian Turnof, and thank you so much for feeding your brain on another great episode of The Mind's Eye Show on Z Talk Radio. Until next time.